Welcome back to the JavaScript Essential Training Series. I am Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we'll be talking about variables inside of JavaScript. So variables in JavaScript. Variables are placeholders for data in programming languages. They're used to store values that will be used in the execution of the program. Variables can store many different types of data. In JavaScript, variables are declared by the keyword var, and we'll demonstrate that when we get inside the lab. Variables in JavaScript cannot start with a number, so we can have no numbers as the starting placeholder for variable names. Many times you'll hear variables referred to as containers for storing values in a program, and that's true because they're storing some type of numeric or string value inside the program or inside the execution of the program. Just like in algebra, we use variables to hold values. All JavaScript variables must be identified with unique names. In programming, variable names are called identifiers. And variable names can be short, like X, or they can be descriptive, like total value of sales. Anything you want to use for your variable name, as long as it falls within the parameters of the name itself, you can use as a variable name. Variables must be declared in JavaScript, so we have to declare a variable in JavaScript before we can actually assign it values. And variables in JavaScript are case sensitive. All variables in JavaScript must be started with a letter or an underscore, and we'll talk about that as we go. Normally I would not use underscores, and we'll discuss that as we get further along in the tutorials. All the characters in a variable name must be letters, numbers, or underscores. No special characters are allowed, and we'll talk more about that as we get further along in the tutorial series, because there's a very special reason why we can't use special characters in variable names. So rules for variable names in JavaScript: names can contain letters, digits, underscores, and the $sign, but I don't use the $sign. I would not recommend using the $sign. It can be confused with other programming languages. I would stick to using letters, digits, and underscores. Names must begin with a letter. They can't start with a number. Names can begin with a $sign or an underscore, but that is not a best practice. And we'll talk about that more as we get through, as we move along in these tutorials. It is a valid value to begin a name in JavaScript, a variable name, with a $sign or an underscore. But again, it's not a best practice. I would not recommend it. And as you work through the tutorial series, as we get further along in the series, you'll see why it's not recommended, because it can be confused with some reserved characters inside JavaScript and other programming languages. Again, names are case sensitive in JavaScript, variable names, so be very careful how you name them. Reserved words like keywords cannot be used as variable names, and that's true with any programming language. When you have reserved words that are reserved for the programming language itself, obviously they cannot be used as variable names inside JavaScript. So let's move into our development environment, and we'll demonstrate what we've talked about inside of our presentation. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and minimize my presentation. Get into my development environment. I want to confirm that my Apache server is up and running. Excellent. I want to bring up Sublime Text 3. That'll be my text editor of choice for this demonstration. And I'm going to bring up Google Chrome as my browser. I've actually have my template.html file loaded. That is my generic template that I use for all my demonstrations. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as variable.html. Be a nice blank file. I'm just going to go ahead and change the title to variables. And I'm going to give myself an H3 inside that container, variables inside JavaScript. And if you have purchased the tutorial series, you'll have access to all these exercise files inside the exercise folder for this particular section. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the browser. Let's go ahead and bring up the variables.html file, and we've got our H3 title up there so we know we're in the right file. All right, so the first thing we need to do if we're going to be working with variables inside of JavaScript, obviously we need to open up our script tags. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the script tags inside my text editor, give myself a few lines so we can go in there and actually demonstrate some variables. So variables are appropriately named as the values that they store can vary as the program executes. And that's why we call them variables, because the values that are stored inside variables can change as the program is going through its execution. And you'll see that as we work through many of our demonstrations as we get further along in the tutorials. So I'm just going to declare a variable x, and I'm going to say variable x is equal to 23. So I've got my variable, and the name is x, my equal sign, 23, and then I'm just going to go down here and using the same one that we've used in the previous exercises, document.write, but this time instead of bringing up a text string, I'm just going to go ahead and put in x, put in the name of my variable, and it with a semicolon, because we know that we end all of our statements in JavaScript with a semicolon. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my browser window, and you'll notice we have 23 in the browser window. If I were to change this to write capital X, and again, remember we talked about this in the presentation, variables in JavaScript are case sensitive. That's not true for all programming languages, but in JavaScript they are case sensitive. If I refresh my browser window, I'm not going to get anything there because as far as JavaScript knows, there is no variable capital X. All we have is a variable small x. Refresh the browser window, and now we have our 23 back. The equal sign is the assignment operator in JavaScript. So when I say variable x equals 23, I'm assigning the value 23 to that variable. That is similar to many other programming languages. Variables can store many different types of values. Numbers are just one example. Variable names are also case sensitive, as we discussed and I just demonstrated. So let's look at another example. I'm going to come down and I'm going to give myself a variable, or I'm going to create a variable called Mike. And that is going to be equal to a string this time, and I'm going to say variable 1. And you'll notice that because it's string data, when I mean string data now I'm talking about text, because it's string data, I've enclosed it in quotation marks. Then I'm going to create another variable right below that, and it's Mike with a capital, and I'm going to say this is variable 2. So now I have two variables, one which is string variable 1, one is a string variable 2. I recommend that when you work through these with me, it'll make learning this much easier. So I'm kind of hoping that you're working through these exercises with me. Great time to pause if you want to type this in. It does make it much better if you work through the demonstrations. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to put, in fact, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this from my text file so you don't have to watch me write it. And I'm just going to come down below those variables and I'm going to put two document.write statements. And I'm going to bring in both variable 1 and variable 2, very similar to what we did in the previous exercise. But this time I'm actually bringing in my two string variables. And you'll notice I have variable 1 and variable 2. And again, based on how they're brought up, it's executed, the statements are executed in the order that they're brought in. Variables can hold values dynamically. So let's look at an example of variable values that's stored dynamically. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come down and I'm going to grab three variables. I'm going to go ahead and copy these from my exercise file. So I have a variable sale 1, a variable sale 2, and a variable sale 3. Let me go ahead and save all those changes. Good time to pause if you want to type those in. And now what I want to do is I'm going to actually come down here and I'm going to create another variable based on the values of the previous variables. And we do this a lot in programming. So now I'm saying my variable total is equal to the value of sale 1 plus sale 2 plus sale 3. So I'm taking the values in these three variables and I'm creating a new variable called total. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come down. I'm going to come down right below this. I'm actually going to give myself a line break. So I've got document.write. I'm creating a line break inside my code. And then I'm creating the value, or I'm printing the value of the total variable, which should be 10 plus 25 plus 15. Let's go ahead and save all these changes. Refresh my browser window. And now you'll see we have the value of 50. So I've taken three values in three different variables, and I've created a new variable based on the value of those variables. And if I change one of the variables, let's change that one to 20, save the change, refresh my browser window, it's going to readjust the value of total because it's actually summing those totals as the program executes. So it's dynamically updating the value of the variable. just by the execution of the program. Every time I refresh the browser window, I'm re-executing that program. Of course, there are better ways to do any of this stuff that we've done. I've basically just done this for the sake of the demonstration, just so you can see how we store values in variables and how we can actually create new variables from existing variables. You're going to get plenty of practice doing this as we work through the exercises in this tutorial series. We use variables in JavaScript. In fact, we use variables in most all programming language constantly. That's the beauty of a programming language, is being able to take the values in variables, pass them along to other aspects of the program to make things much more dynamic, much more reactive to things that are going on inside our application. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got a brief understanding of how variables work inside JavaScript. Don't worry if you don't understand it completely, because you're going to have plenty of practice as we work through these. We will be working through variables throughout probably almost every one of the demonstrations we do throughout the entire Essential Training series in JavaScript. So I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.